Well, we are closing out a series today that we've been in for 4 weeks now called Rules of Engagement. And as we do so, here's what we want to talk about today. And kind of perfect timing with music camp and just thinking about our journey as a faith community and as a body where there are young people in our midst. Today, we want to talk about, as we close out this series, our responsibility when it comes to the next generation, and what God calls us to do when it comes to those who will come after us. Now, I'm thinking about this week. In a community of faith like this, you know, I was on the phone 2 times last week with a woman who's about to be 101. So I'm not even the next generation to her. So we got to watch kind of how we say that, you know. I'm several generations, right? But when we think about that handoff, you know, I do think it's important for us to think about the kids. But some of our kids are grown, you know, so we're going to think about a lot of different relationships. It is great to think about the kids. Some of you don't have kids, and you have an influence anyway. It is great to think about our own kids and think about the parenting relationship, but we have access to, we're put in a position by God to influence the next generation in many and varied ways beyond just parenting. So here in essence is really what we want to zero in on with that in mind. Whenever we find ourselves in a position to influence a young life or at least a younger life, okay? Whenever we find that opportunity, whenever we're in the midst of that responsibility, here's what we're calling that today, and I hope it takes things deeper for us. That is a sacred trust. You know, when it comes to biblical stewardship, when it comes to our giving, we might understand, God, every dollar you give me, sacred trust, you know? How much more so when it comes, again, not just to our children, but to others in the world that we can have an influence over, again, that we can perhaps even pass our faith along to. I mean, how much more of a sacred trust is that? And so what we want to talk about today is when it comes to this sacred trust, a sacred trust that is primarily not just between us and the other person, a sacred trust that is primarily between us and God. Why? Because God's given us that opportunity, right? God has placed that person in our path. Today we simply want to ask, okay, God, how can we best go about embracing this sacred trust? Now, as we begin today, just to get the juices flowing and think about this, I want you to think for a moment, how does this apply to you? Or how are you caught up in this a bit? Because again, while being a parent is the most obvious way that God entrusts the next generation to us, it's not the only way. So for some of you, for example, you know as you think about this that you are entrusted with the care of the next generation through your work, through your profession. As a teacher, you recognize the sacred trust it is on your best days when they're behaving pretty well, right? You recognize the sacred trust it is. The teachers out there are smiling really big. You recognize, though, the sacred trust it is to nurture, to care for the next generation. What a responsibility. What a gift that is. Sacred trust. Some of you have taken on the job of coach at one time or another. Maybe you're a coach right now. And you understand, gosh, what an opportunity with those athletes, what an opportunity with those kids or those young people to influence, to lead them into a deeper life, one like you have found. Some of you have committed yourself to serving in our children's ministry here at Beamer. What an opportunity that has given you to nurture young lives. Those of you who put in so much time and energy this week in our music camp, you know, that effort now doesn't go away. And hey, appreciate what you did in the past. Oh, that'll ripple into every day in the future. Because of how you touched those young lives, how you embraced that very sacred trust. Or even think about other relationships in all of our lives. If you are an aunt, an uncle, a grandparent, an older sister or brother, maybe you volunteer at school when school is in session. You touch lives in that way. Maybe you've gotten involved with an organization like Big Brothers, like Big Sisters. Truth is, all of us, in one way or another, have been entrusted with someone from the next generation, so to speak. And because of that, here's our focus, here's our question with this last rule of engagement. Are we clear in the midst of those opportunities what God is asking us to do? Are we really clear in the midst of those moments of influence what God is really wanting us to do? And if we're not for sure, let's clarify that today. Here's what God is calling us to do in their midst. He's calling us to help our kids or to help the next generation understand His love for them, right? But He's also calling us to do this, to help them love Him. And not just slightly, right? But with what? With all their heart and soul and mind and strength. And so that's what we want to talk about today. God, we know this is a major part of our relating to others in this life. And so, God, how can we best do that? Help them know God's love for them. Help them come to love God deeply. For 4 weeks now, we've been exploring together what we're calling rules of engagement, these biblical principles that we know if we engage them, they can help us to have healthier relationships, stronger relationships. If you've had to miss any of these weeks, go online, listen in. I think there's some stuff there that can be helpful to us. This week, though, as we close out this series focused on the next generation, here's the passage we want to turn to initially today. Deuteronomy 6. And we turn to Deuteronomy 6 today for this reason. Because here in this passage, God speaks very specifically about how we are to care for and nurture the next generation. Or in other words, here in Deuteronomy 6, God speaks very directly about what we are to do as we strive to influence those who come after us. And so listen to initially what God is saying here, because here's what He's saying. He's telling us, of course, we need to make sure that we take care of our top priority. What is our top priority always? To personally love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. But then He says, once you have done that, you need to leverage your faith in the lives of others. You need to now leverage your love for me in the lives of those who it may not be that they don't know you, but they haven't gone really deep into their love for God. And so let's kind of take a look at that and see what we hear here. Here's the advice we find in Deuteronomy 6, verses 7, 8, and 9. Impress them. So impress these commands of God that we must embrace if we're going to be able to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength. But also, again, impress our faith, right? Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands, bind them on your foreheads, write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. Now, one of the things that we can't help but take away from this, and one of the things that I think we just know inherently when it comes to caring for the next generation, this takes some work. Hard work at times. But what we find here even more than that is this: it takes intentionality. Where we say, okay, God, I need to intentionally do certain things if I'm going to be able to truly embrace and honor this sacred trust. So let's look at some of those things today. I want to lead you to 3 things. The first one connects back to our Deuteronomy passage. First, if we want to impact the next generation, leverage our faith with them. And I know this first thought's very foundational, but that's why we start here. First, to embrace the sacred trust that we've been given, we've got to make passing on our faith a priority. We've got to make passing on our faith a priority. Now, some of the things that can help us with this, especially when we are talking about our kids or we are talking about our grandkids, an obvious thing that can help us with this is to simply worship each and every week without fail, making that a non-negotiable in our family because we know how important it is, and we want them to know how important it is as well. I mean, what are some of the things we're reminded here? How much God loves us, and man, how much we long to love Him even more throughout the week. So one way to make passing on your faith a priority relates to what we're doing right now. But here's the interesting thing when it comes to that. And we really hear this in our passage. Here's what we've always got to remember, that actually passing on our faith to the next generation does not primarily happen here. I hate to even say it that way because I know you're thinking, you're wrong, isn't this where it happens? Actually, as important as worship is, Sunday school, children's church, youth group, right? The passing on of faith does happen here to some degree, but not primarily. According to the passage, where does it primarily happen? Out there, right? At home. Along the road as we're walking along with those who come after us. Sitting at the table, right? It primarily happens through those intentionally created conversations. It's so interesting how when we have that chance to engage the next generation, I hope you'll take this deep within today. And I need to do the same, I think, for all of us. It's very interesting, kind of sad when we think about how often for us as followers of Jesus Christ, when we have that chance to engage the next generation, we default to what? Small talk, right? That's easier, So we might default to, how do you think the Gators are going to do this year? Now, I know many of you would say, shame on you, Pastor, that is not small talk. That has never been small talk in the history of the world, right? But I know that you know that it is, right? We have a chance when we engage those who come after us to move from, how do you think the Gators are going to do, and to move into, genuinely, hey, how are you? Haven't talked for a while, How's work? How's marriage? How's your hopes and dreams, right? Because I promise you, unless we're willing to try to engage deeper, not a perfect system, doesn't always seem to work, but unless we're willing to go there to something deeper in our conversations, God can't ever show up naturally. And do you know what I mean by naturally? It's not kind of hitting them over the head with, hey, I'll tell you what, here's how you need to fly right. It's, hey, what's going on in life? And then naturally other things will come up. Might not be in every conversation, but boy, it begins to lay the groundwork. How interesting that when we have opportunities to do that, we often default to the mundane. It's safer, isn't it? But we got to stick our neck out. Why? Sacred trust. Again, that's what it means in our passage when we read, talk about them, talk about those deeper things. And when the opportunity arises, how faith and God relate to those deeper things. Talk about them. Right? Not just here, and we have to do it here. But when you sit at home, when you walk along the road, when you lie down, when you get up. Now, for some of you, it doesn't apply to all of us. It applied more so perhaps to the 8 o'clock service. It'll apply more so perhaps to the 11 o'clock service. But for those of you who have grown children, sometimes the hardest thing when it comes to this, when the next generation who's a part of your life now lives somewhere else, no longer live with you, and it changes that dynamic, one of the hardest things can be trying to figure out, well, how do I keep that conversation alive? How do I do it well when the dynamic has changed? And you can probably guess what I would say to you, specifically in that situation. Just engage them in conversations about life, deeper ones, And then do what? Then don't immediately move into faith, right? And listen, In the midst of any conversation about life and deeper life, you know what will always happen? God's got to come up somewhere. It's life, Eventually faith has to come up. Might not be in the first conversation, might not be in the 100th. But it's just about engaging those deeper conversations. First, if we're going to embrace the sacred trust that we have been given, we've got to make passing on faith. We've got to make that a priority in our lives. So ask yourself first today, are you committed to passing on your faith? And if you think that you are, then what does that look like for you right now? In terms of worship being a non-negotiable for you and your family, in terms of conversations that matter being a big part of how you walk with next generation. Again, not just as a parent, but as a key influencer as well. First, how are you passing on your faith? Are you committed to that? Secondly, if we want to fully embrace our sacred trust, then we've got to do this. We've got to make prayer a priority as relates to this. We've got to make a deeper prayer life something that we intentionally strive for each day, especially as relates to trying to pass on our faith. Now, where do we start with this kind of praying? And it might sound selfish, it might sound odd, but we start with self. You know, not a selfish thing. We've got to always start when it comes to this by saying, God, first off, I need you to guide me in how I'm trying to pass on my faith. First off, God, I need you to help me as I try to nurture the next generation. And why is that where it's always got to start? Because it's hard. Some of you might say to me later, I try so hard with my kids, and now they are grown, and now they aren't in the house, now they have kids of their own. And oftentimes our frustration doesn't come from, it necessarily being something that we can engage and don't want to engage. We feel like we're hitting a brick wall, and primarily, why do some of us find ourselves there? We haven't started with, God, this is hard work. You help me, So first off, as parents, to rise each day and say, hey, God, help me pass on my faith today in some very real ways. To say as teachers, as coaches, as key influencers, God, even in the midst of some limitations, help me somehow be a positive influence related to faith in their lives. So first, funny as it sounds, we need to pray for self. But then next, obviously, we've got to also be praying intentionally for that other person, that sacred trust that's been given to us. And actually, most of the time, all that prayer needs to sound like is this: God, as only you can, open their hearts to you this day. Open their hearts a bit wider to how you want to walk with them, to what you're saying to them, to how you're trying to lead them. Again, no condemnation. No, they got to, get their life together, but just, God, you made them. You want to walk with them. Open their hearts just a little bit. Listen to how Paul here in Colossians 1, 9, and 10. Listen to how he talks about how he is praying for those God has given to him. And I think there's even a why in here. Why does he do this? And we can learn from that. He writes, for this reason, since the day that we heard about you, we've not stopped praying for you and asking God to fill you. This is leveraging his faith in their lives. Asking God to fill you with the knowledge of his will through all spiritual wisdom, through all understanding. And we pray this, here's the why. And we pray this in order that you may live a life worthy of the Lord and may please him in every way, bearing fruit in every good work, growing in the knowledge of God. Of course, we would all assume, of course, Paul is praying for those he's trying to reach, those God is handing to him. But to get a little deeper sense of the why, that they might have a strong faith. Man, that reminds us how we are to pray for others, those who've been given to us. And so with that in mind, ask yourself secondly today, have you made prayer a priority in your life, especially related to your influence in the lives of others? And if you haven't, then begin to work on that. To first pray for self, God, work through me somehow, guide me in my conversations. But then to also pray deeply again for the young people in your life, that their hearts might be open. Is praying a part of that for you? And then there's a final thing we've got to do in order to care for the next generation. This is critical. Last but not least, we've got to now make living out our faith a priority. Does that make sense? Especially if we have made passing on our faith a priority, now we got to make living that faith out a priority. Meaning this, we got to make sure that our actions match our words. We got to make sure that what we do matches with what we say. William Booth, in The Founder's Messages to Soldiers, he writes this: faith and works should travel side by side, step answering to step, like the legs of men walking. First faith and then works, and then faith again and then works again, until they can scarcely distinguish which is one and which is the other. Truth is, through the decisions we make, the choices we make, the values we embrace, the example we set, all of those speak to the reality of our faith perhaps more than words ever can. Meaning some of the greatest lessons our kids will ever learn, or our grandkids, our nieces, our nephews, those, again, who've been placed in our lives. Some of the greatest lessons they'll learn from you won't be the lessons you speak, but instead, they'll be the lessons you live out. For example, if we choose not to attend worship more than just every once in a while, we don't prioritize it in our life, then the next generation, no matter what we say, they begin to understand, worshiping God, it's not that important. Or if we choose not to serve others within the church, beyond the church, if we choose not to use the giftedness that God has placed within us, then the next generation begins to learn, serving others is just not that important. Or if we don't tend to spend daily time with God trying to grow in our faith, then those close enough to us to know that begin to understand, as much as mom and dad, as much as this key influencer in my life says, this is something I need to do, I need to look to God, I need to lean on God, I guess it isn't that important. Again, recognizing the connection here between our words and our actions, ask yourself lastly today, how do your values, your choices, your priorities match up with the faith you profess? And if there is some dissonance there, or if that does give you some pause, then spend some time just thinking about that, praying over that this week. Our fifth rule of engagement: embrace your sacred trust. Truth is, all of us are given opportunities in this life to have an impact on the next generation. Even those of you who are young people here today, it's interesting, in the midst of music camp, and I hate to do a diversion right at the end, but it dawns on me, even our older elementary, the influence they could have on the younger kids. You who are youth out there, my goodness, those who served at music camp, the difference you can make in the lives of younger people, just know that. Even a couple grades below you. All of us have an opportunity to influence the next generation. We're called, we know that as well, we're called to influence the next generation. And so this week, all I would ask you to do is to pray deeply, and may this be your prayer, and pray this actually every day as long as it takes until it becomes kind of clear. It might become clear quickly, it might take a while. But knowing that we all have opportunities to influence, knowing that we're called to do that as followers of Jesus Christ, just start praying and pray as long as you need to. God, what's that look like for me? Right now, in terms of who you have placed in my life, who are those who are my sacred trust? And what are you asking me to do? Let's pray.